And Jonathan Edwards, like John Bunyan, would never have allowed his conscience to rob him of the purity of his understanding of justification. He would never have allowed his conscience to ultimately and finally condemn him. But neither would Jonathan Edwards ignore his conscience. In fact, it strikes me that when he made these resolutions, he wasn't talking to another person. He wasn't making a promise to men. Frankly, that would have been far more than any man would have expected. 70 resolutions? Nobody would have held him to that standard. Nobody would have expected him to articulate all of that. And on the other hand, he didn't make those promises to God either. He knew better than that. That's stepping into the danger zone. That's why I said I could never be a promise keeper. If they start an organization for promise breakers, I'll join. I'm not about to make pledges to God that I can't keep. Jonathan Edwards made 70 resolutions. Are you ready for this? To himself. He made pledges to his own heart, to his own soul, because he understood the severity of the battle of sanctification. And he knew where it had to be won. And it wasn't going to be won outside of him, it was going to be won inside of him. Why 70 resolutions? I mean, I used to go to camp when I was a kid and they'd say, read the Bible for 15 minutes a day, like that was some spiritual triumph. What do you think he knew? They called him to 70 resolutions. And what do you think he knew about himself, that he made promises to himself, 70 of them, and determined and kept the pledge that he would recite them to himself every week of his life and at the end of every month and at the end of every year? What was he doing? I mean, to be really honest, some of you can barely get your flip-flops on and make it to the Saturday night service. And you wonder why you don't have any spiritual victory? What did Jonathan Edwards know? You'd think if you're that profound and that gifted and that godly, it might be a little easier. I'll tell you what he knew. He knew the severity of the battle going on in his own soul for his own sanctification. And he knew that he was his own worst enemy. It was in that imaginary Orwellian year of 1984. And there was a flight. It was a flight of Avianca Airlines. A jet. It crashed in Spain. Flew, as far as we could tell, straight into a mountain. And of course, investigators studied the accident site, recovered the proverbial black box, and they made an eerie discovery. The black box from the wreckage of that Boeing aircraft had contained in it a voice recorder which revealed the several minutes before the fatal impact. And the first thing that the investigators heard was a shrill, sort of computer-synthesized voice from the plane's automatic warning system, and it told the crew in English, they were a Spanish crew, it told the crew in English, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up. And then, astoundingly, the voice of the pilot was heard, snapping back, "Shut up, gringo." And he switched the system off. In a matter of minutes, the plane smashed into the side of a mountain and everybody was instantly killed. As I read about that a number of years ago in connection with a book I was writing on the vanishing conscience, it struck me that that is in some ways a parable of the way modern people treat the warning system that God's put in their souls. God has given us some very, very gracious gifts. And one of them is conscience. And we hear about it. There are little phrases, guilty conscience, etc., that we often perhaps use or hear used. But I think the conscience is one of the least understood gifts that God has granted to us, one of the least understood areas of biblical teaching, and I want to draw your attention to it. Maybe to give you a parallel is a good place to begin. You also have another system in your body. It's called pain. It's very helpful. It is very helpful. It's a warning system. It's exactly what it is, and it's designed to tell you that something is wrong with you physically. And if you just continue to override that pain, you will do permanent damage to yourself. You can thank the Lord that you can feel pain. That's a gift that God has given us to warn us when we are doing damage to our bodies. And conscience, like that, is the same kind of warning system that God has given to us to tell us when we're doing damage to our souls, when we're doing damage to the spiritual part of us. In Romans chapter 2, it says, the Gentiles, verse 14, who do not have the law, do instinctively the things in the law, these not having the law are law to themselves, verse 15, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, and I don't want to get to this part, their conscience bearing witness. The conscience is a witness, and it has two functions. It either, according to that verse, in their thoughts, it either indicts you or it defends you. It either says this is good for you or this is bad for you. It is the most important warning system because it's dealing not with the outside but with the inside. To do anything to make conscience function less than perfectly is to engage in soul-destroying activity. The wisdom of our day wants to render the conscience ineffective. The enemy, the god of this age, who develops the system that surrounds us in the world, wants us to ignore conscience and misinform conscience. Conscience may be saying, pull up, pull up, pull up, while the culture is saying, shut up, gringo, and turning off the switch. It may be just a reversal of all moral values. It may be the idea that guilt is toxic or whatever. But we live in a society that's trying to do two things, and I just want you to think about these two things. One, misinform conscience, and two, shut it off. There were two things happening in that airplane. One thing that was happening was radar was finding a mountain, right? Radar was sending out a bounce-back signal that was informing that warning system that there was a mountain. Radar was articulating reality. And then there was the responding warning system that told the pilot what to do in face of that reality. Only two things needed to happen to save the lives of those people. One, you had to know what was reality, and secondly, you had to accept the warning. Sanctification functions on those same two principles. Starts with knowing the truth. Your conscience has to be fully informed about the truth in order to properly warn you. False information telling you to pull up confuses everything. I'll give you an illustration. A couple of weeks ago, I happened to be on Larry King Live, and I know some of you have seen me on there. It's always really interesting, and what's interesting is what you don't see. What happens in between, between Deepak and me, and which is really kind of funny. Deepak is a pantheist who is convinced that God is in all of us, but mostly in him. This was in between airtime. And Dennis Prager said to Larry King, well, what kind of a Jew are you? He said, well, I'm an agnostic, secular Jew. He said, well, so you're not a religious Jew? No, I'm not a religious Jew at all. I'm a secular Jew. But he said, I'll tell you this. I was raised in a very kosher Jewish family. And to this day, now this is Larry King, and he's in his 60s, and he's gone through 7 wives and a whole world of experience. But from my childhood, he said this, if you gave me milk and meat in the same meal, I'd vomit. Wow. What would make him vomit? Because from the time he was a little kid, he was informed that violated the law of God. And that has so stuck in his mind that it triggers his conscience and makes him sick. You know, that's encouraging to me. If he's still got that sensitive a conscience, if we could just get it the right information, they could function. You know, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he said, if you go to a non-believer's house, a non-believer, a Gentile non-believer invites you over, okay? For dinner, he's a non-believer. And you bring along a weaker brother, right? You bring along a new believer who's just been saved. You know what Paul says? He says, you offend the unbeliever. And do not ever train another believer to ignore his conscience, because you are divesting him of an instrument that God wants to keep sensitive. The conscience is a critical part of our spiritual life. Jonathan Edwards was talking to himself. He was talking to his own conscience in all those resolutions when he went over them again and again and again. Didn't need a crowd. He didn't need somebody there. He didn't tape record it to be publicly broadcast. It wasn't even prayer. Are you ready for that? The conscience is the soul reflecting on itself. It is at the core of what distinguishes human beings from animals. No ape ever made a resolution. This is what it is to be self-conscious, self-aware, reflecting on ourselves. It is our own innate ability to understand what is right and what is wrong, and to make determinations to do what is right and not what is wrong. When the conscience functions as it should, when it's violated, it produces shame, regret, guilt, fear, anxiety, disgrace, anguish, and sometimes even depression. Now, conventional wisdom would say, you better go see a counselor. I'm afraid some people in the evangelical world would say, if you have shame, regret, guilt, fear, anxiety, disgrace, anguish, and depression, you better go see a Christian counselor. You can't allow yourself to be indicted like that. I mean, even if Isaiah in chapter 6 showed up and said, I'm a man of unclean lips, somebody might say to him, you need some counsel. You need some help. You got to think better of yourself. You're the best guy going. You speak, God speaks. You're really not to blame. You got toxic parents, as one writer said. Or you ate too many Twinkies and it's having this effect on you. Or you took a pill, that's why you killed your grandparents, right? There's going to be a quasi-medical or psychological explanation for everything. And it's tantamount to saying to your conscience, shut up, gringo, flipping the switch. In fact, you can get so good at it, Paul says in Philippians 3:19, that with some people, this is really amazing, their glory is in their shame. Boy, now you know that thing is not functioning at all. Their glory is in their shame. Look at the MTV generation. What are they proud about? How base can you get? You think that's new? Go back and read Isaiah 5, where they substitute good for bad and bitter for sweet.